panel, and then we'll go ahead and move into remarks related to the questions that we've teed up on the agenda. Danielle. So first we have NLN Reddy, Executive Director of MARI. Hello, thank you. Danielle Morley, the Executive Secretary for the Freshwater Action Network. Hi, Danielle. Next, Henry Northover, the Head of Policy for WaterAid. Henry, how are you? Greg Koch, Director of Global Water Stewardship for the Coca-Cola Company. Hi, Greg. And finally, we've had a change on the agenda, and we have Dr. Kulwant Singh. He's the Regional Advisor, United Nations Human Settlements Program. So welcome to all of you. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to just read out two questions that have come in that are related to WASH. This is not to ask you to change your remarks in relation to the questions, but more to just have them in the background as we have the discussion, if that's okay. So one question came in and it just said, and you'll see these are very, very related to the questions that have been posed already. The first is, donors are scaling back funding to foreign aid efforts such as WASH. What are some areas that the private sector can fill the gap left by donors, and what areas can the private sector not fulfill? And again, this lines up quite well with some of the pre-prepared questions that we had. So again, just wanted to be aware of that. And a second question that came in, and again, both of these came in through the live feed, is the private sector view that there should be a future water goal that encompasses WASH, water resources, wastewater, etc., or that each subsector should be split up among the overarching future goals? All right, so as you speak to the questions just related specifically to WASH, if you have an opportunity to also make an observation about does it make sense to roll up or to maintain at the thematic level would be very helpful. Okay, so what I'd like to do, and again, we need to be as mindful as we can of time here. I'd like to start with the first two questions, related questions. First, should there be water-related goals? And then if so, what issues should new water-related goals ideally cover? And as you know on the panel, and as you know as participants from the agenda, the lens for this conversation in this panel is WASH, the WASH perspective for that particular thematic area. So if I might, may I start with you, sir? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity given. I think WASH should be part of this goal setting because it is important determinant in terms of poverty reduction and health scenario. Secondly, I think right to water and sanitation is now center stage of policy dialogue and international discourse. Given the performance the Millennium Development Goals in terms of sanitation, particularly there is a poor performance, and given that this sanitation should be given priority. Sanitation is very much interlinked to the water per se. So therefore, this is very important. To put the whole thing into a perspective, I just go back a little back. So morning there is a discussion on the role to be played by the corporates. I think whatever came from the morning is a little bit more from user perspective. It is more within the fence. But what we need to look is going beyond that thing and look at as a co-facilitator, because the corporate sector has resources, strengths and capacities to really facilitate some of the gaps within the system and the community level. And second thing is it also have a responsibility to really influence the society, and as a corporate social agenda it needs to really work in the spaces and cracks created by the government system. The government delivery mechanisms are poor and they are not able to influence the process in such that equity and influence reaching the poor, people who are living in distant locations, excluded communities and all that. Therefore, that should be the overall framework around which the corporate should work. That's the feeling, and within MARI we have such experience. Maybe I'll bring it later. But in terms of setting goals, water sustainability should be an important issue. And because it's more on health outcomes, we need to really look at how these interlinkages of waterborne diseases, health-related and sanitation interlinkages are to be addressed, and more so right to water and sanitation. If you look at the MDGs last several years, I think national government has not really taken up this as an issue, though international agenda has identified. So right to water agenda should be given thrust on that. And then there should also be focus on hard to reach areas, particularly the tribal and other communities which are really not having access. And finally, we should have, earlier also the speakers mentioned about universal access to the resources and maintenance thereof. So where there are various opportunities that are existing in that, and we need to look on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Danielle, may I turn to you next?
Thank you. I'd like to just maybe take a little bit of a step back and think about access to water and sanitation and the so-called bottom billion. And in the case of sanitation, it's 2.6 billion. Why don't they have access to services? And we have a serious governance problem and a deep lack of accountability towards the world's poorest people who are denied access. To bridge this accountability gap requires a concerted effort, and will a new global framework make the difference that we seek? So we had the Millennium Development Goal framework, and it proved an effective focus for action, but it also was limited in scope in that it didn't address the structural causes of poverty and reduce the process to a series of goals and average attainment rates, and sort of became the dominant paradigm, and thereby ditched the notion that development is the process of the right to development. And partially we can trace this back to after the Second World War, when the UN was negotiating the international covenants on economic, social and cultural rights, and on social and political rights and civil rights, and there was a division between economic development and sort of the traditional human rights, that has persisted until this day. Things are slowly changing now, and in 2010 we had, for example, recognition by the UN and by the governments of the world that there is a right to water and sanitation that's derived from the right to an adequate standard of living, and could post-2015 be a moment to push the dial further in terms of realigning the global development framework on a rights-based agenda? And from the perspective of civil society, who I work with, the Freshwater Action Network, and we've been part of a global coalition called Beyond 2015, which has pulled together over 500 civil society organisations around the world who've just developed their position paper on the 2015 framework. That was top of the list in terms of that the post-2015 framework should be realign development around a rights-based agenda, and I can talk in more detail as to the rationale behind that. And in addition, should integrate, as we heard earlier, the three pillars of sustainability, and address production and consumption patterns. And clearly the private sector has a key role in addressing in production and consumption systems, and also has a role in supporting an enabling environment to realise the right to water and sanitation. Shall I stop now? I mean, just in terms of the format, do you want to?
I would. That would be great. I think you teed up some interesting ideas. Thank you. And I'd like to just move on at this point. So, Henry, if could please come in.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah.
So, to the question, should WASH have its own goal in a post-2015 era? I would say emphatically yes, and I'd perhaps go further to say we should start to think about privileging access to sanitation and water. And the reason I make that case, that rather stronger case for WASH, we're at the moment in India, in this country, despite rapid economic growth rates, 1 in every 4th child on this planet that dies of diarrhea is in India. And diarrhea is the second biggest killer of children worldwide. The biggest killer of children in India is pneumonia. There is good, compelling evidence now that hygiene behavior or the lack of hygiene behavior, the lack of access to soap, washing your hands with clean water is responsible for about 50% of those cases. So there is a huge attrition rate on our children through lack of wash. Sanitation is the worst performing MDG sector out of all of them. And as one of your online questionnaires put it, why is it that aid has been falling to WASH? Well, since the 1990s, the share of aid going to WASH has been contracting, and the aid that is there is extremely poorly targeted. So that most of the aid for water and sanitation goes to middle-income countries. If you are a Malaysian citizen without access to WASH, you will get about $200 worth of aid per year. Okay? If you're in West Africa, you will get less than $1. There is a huge mismatch between where the need is and where the aid is going. And this is where I think the private sector has a role. Yes, it can act as a source of finance, but by and large, the private sector, due to the fragility of circumstances in low-income countries, tends to be put off from investing in those areas. So how can the private sector work in order to make investable portfolios, investable propositions in low-income countries in fragile states? And my suggestion is that if the private sector starts to align and harmonize its work, as Aloka was talking about in the earlier session, behind government-led strategies, you are far more likely to build and develop an investable portfolio that is capable of ensuring that the poor are reached and you get returns. So the private sector has a strong role to act as an agent for change, but increasingly, I would argue that the private sector must now start coordinating, harmonizing its efforts, and acting on plan, government-led plans. We all know how weak the capacity is of government, and in a post-2015 era, that everyone now must turn their efforts to ensuring that government has the capacity to ensure services.
Henry, thank you. Greg, turning to you next.
I'll just give you food for thought, and then I'll answer the question, and that is, what if there is no government-led strategy on WASH? So how do you align behind that? Mm-hmm. If you read some of the recent research by Jamie Bartram, formerly of the World Health Organization, and now at the University of North Carolina, there may be as many as 4 billion people without access to safe, high-quality drinking water throughout the day from a sustainable source, and that is sustainably managed in terms of the intervention. So I think the problem with the progress we've made being lauded is still very significant across the world. So yes, I do believe, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has put forward our comments, which I agree with, to Peter Brabeck as part of the consultation process to the UN. And there should be a WASH goal. I personally believe we need a water goal encompassing of wastewater treatment, sustainability of supplies, and some of the other things that the other panels will be talking about. But I agree with you in that WASH should be a standalone goal, and this was not in the WBCSD memo to Peter Brabeck, and it should be at the top of the Sustainable Development Goals list. And the reason is obvious, I hope, to everyone in the room, in that you cannot solve any of the other goals until you solve the WASH equation. So I think we need one. I think it should be standalone. I agree with the gentleman from Nestle in terms of the timing, universal access by 2025, improved sanitation by 2020 basic sanitation by 2020 and improved sanitation by 2030. This is a solvable problem. This is not something we're waiting on a cure for, an answer for. There's always room for new technology and financing and delivery schemes, but it is something that we know how to do today, and we cannot solve any of the problems without doing it. I want to echo what you said about attainment rates. In addition to having an end date goal, whether it's 2020, 2030, whatever it may be, we need attainment rate and milestone goals along the way. We also need sub-goals on the safety of that supply. There's been a lot of boreholes that have been drilled, and then people claiming people have access to safe water. They may have access to water, but has anyone really assessed the safety of that water across water quality parameters? Has the sustainability of that water source been determined? I think that should be another part of that goal. It does no good to provide somebody access to safe drinking water if the sustainability, the viability of that source of water is inadequate. Of course, I think we can refine the distance that people have to travel, the length of the day, of the 24 hours that source is actually available to people, and of course the sustainability from a finance standpoint of the actual operation and maintenance of that scheme. And that applies to sanitation. I'd also like to say something that no one's really talked about. Yes, we talk about WASH, but everyone's ignoring the H. H stands for hygiene education. And I think though it's harder to measure progress against a goal like that, you can certainly put some metrics around that may be more qualitative, but there is a responsibility to get the hygiene education and awareness put out there. So I think that should also be part of a very clear, highest priority goal for sustainable development. And then just lastly, to echo Josephina, this isn't 2015, this is 2013, so we still have almost 3 years, and we should redouble our efforts so that the work after 2015 isn't as hard.
Great, thank you. If I may, Dr. Kulwant, please.
Thank you very much giving this opportunity. I would like to, I think, give a little backdrop to the whole thing. When the Millennium Development Goals were adopted in 2000, the world had 6 billion people. As we talk in 2013, 1 billion is added. We are 7 billion, going to be 7 billion during this year on one of the days. At the same time, there is also that world became more than 50% urbanized in 2008. And it's urbanizing quite fast. By another 2030, will be 60% urban. In India, today we have about 380 million people living in towns and cities, and will be adding another 220 million. By 2030 will be 600 million. So this backdrop is very essential to answer some of the questions that you have really referred to, very particularly because if you are talking of urbanization going at this rate and at the way it is happening, you need, when the urbanization takes place, more people come in urban areas, or there are more people, you need, housing, you need water, you need sanitation, you need more energy, you need, I would say, more schools, you need more health facilities. And building all that, you have already discussed since morning, requires water. If you need more steel, you require more water. You need more cement, you require more water. So I'm only trying to say that the changing scenario that we have, as a matter of fact, we really have to keep in mind that, we have to really set the goals. And sustainability does require that. It's not just the Millennium Development Goals. when we started in 2000, we said 2.5 billion, 2.6 billion people do not have sanitation facilities. At the end of 2015 also we'll be having still 2.6, 2.5 billion people without sanitation facilities. Where are we heading for? Early last year, in March 2012 in Marseille, during the World Water Forum, the target that was really set was that of universal access to safe drinking water by 2025 and universal access to sanitation possibly by 2025, if not by 2030. That's a kind of goal that, as a matter of fact, has really been set in. And the responsibility for this, in fact, is not with the government alone. Water is a responsibility for all, where, as a matter of fact, corporate sector, very particularly, which has got resources, which have got the management capabilities, which have got, they are able to contribute in a very big way. I particularly would like to mention that, the example that we really find in the world over, one of the best example available is that of Singapore, no doubt, where we really talk of how they are actually ensuring that they have only 5% non-revenue water. In a country like ours, almost varying between 40 to 60% non-revenue water. A large part of it is because of the leakages, etc., etc. And that's where, as a matter of fact, we need several engineering solutions. There is a role, as a matter of fact, where, corporate sector can particularly play, not only for reducing, let us say, non-revenue water, making it more available, because more the population, particularly more population in urban areas, mean greater need for fresh drinking water. And we have to really find solutions how a finite source will continue serving the growing population on this earth. And that's the real good challenge where perhaps I think we really need to find solutions. We have been, I'll just take one more minute and say, we have been working as UN Habitat, partnering, two of my partners are right on this table, WaterAid, working, in areas like sanitation and showing some of the best examples. We have also been partnering with the private sector, Coca-Cola, BASF from Germany, Osmine from Australia in certain parts, and perhaps I think what we have really found that we can really find answers by creating a synergy so that we are able to carry forward the agenda, because actually as you will really feel how the corporate sector, for example, is not sometimes now limiting itself to the limited goals of their supply chains. But an organization like, for example, Coca-Cola has made a global commitment for water neutrality. You put as much water in the ground as you take it out. And that's a goal that we have globally committed. That's one part. At the same time, we have a challenge, let's say in India, where we are working with them in schools to ensure safe drinking water in schools, sanitation facilities separately for boys and girls. That's where perhaps I think we are working in partnership with Coca-Cola, NDTV, and several others. There are almost like now 100 partners, private, working together. And that's where perhaps I think we are aiming at certain kind of goals that we have to really, establish and move on. And lastly, in this context, our growth pattern in India has been such that in the formal sector it has really not been creating job opportunities. What we have been having is we are using water for growth, but we really need to use water for inclusive growth. I'll argue it for that. And inclusive growth will also mean creating a lot of growth opportunities. I would my friend Greg has not really mentioned, but I will mention that Coca-Cola has, for example, come up with a program of creating what they say 5 by 20, 5 million jobs globally by 2020, particularly for women. And that's where perhaps I think we are also partnering on that and improving the supply chain, and by so doing creating a greater degree of, I would say, efficiency in the entire system. That's what it is. We'll carry on.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to follow up on some of the observations made, and I hope I do justice to the very good thinking that you've laid out. Danielle, I'm going to head back to you first. As I listened to the other speakers, I heard a resounding yes for WASH-related goals, and I heard two reasons, more than two, but two reasons stick out. The extent of the problem, the extent of the remaining problem, number one, and number two, and Greg, you made this point, the dependency of other goals on success in this area. So in the absence of goals here, how can you expect to achieve in other areas? The focus in terms of actual goals seems to be around access, certainly. It seems like all of you mentioned access, and waterborne disease. At least two of you explicitly mentioned waterborne related disease. So Danielle, I wanted to turn to you. You went a little more high level and spoke to this notion of a rights-based framework as a way to sort of reset the sense of development goals. And I'm just wondering how those other observations that focused in the WASH area, how compatible or not you see them with the rights-based framework that you were advocating. Okay? Great.
Well, luckily, I think they are entirely compatible.
That's a good start, by the way.
So, I mean, we can define access to WASH on the basis of the standards that have been set, for example, by the UN resolution on access to water and sanitation. So within that, there's interpretations and definitions which cover accessibility, affordability, the adequateness, the safety of water, etc. So that's all encapsulated within an internationally agreed standard that would then be, if we went for a rights-based framework, we would have universal access to water and sanitation by 2025, 2030, and then states would then interpret the right to water and sanitation at a national level. So then they would develop their own national set of indicators. But what's really important is that they commit to developing a national plan of action for progressive realisation of the right to water and sanitation. Mm-hmm. But none of that can really take place. It all sounds, very, very nice and theoretical. And there's quite a few skeptics as to how a rights-based approach will make the fundamental shift and the difference that we need to see. And it really does need to run in parallel with a process of developing the strengthening engagement between the state and the citizen, and supporting civil society to work with local communities to ensure that the accountability and the redress mechanisms that are accessible by the poor people who currently don't have access. So that's some of the work that our partners here in Hyderabad have been working on, rights-based advocacy, to really, again, so you can take it from the global level and you can see how it can really be applied down at the very local level. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of integration between WASH and water resources and health and so on, again, a rights-based approach would definitely promote and allows for a framework for integration. So decisions made over allocation, for example, would prioritise access to basic level of services for all. So it doesn't take away from an integrative approach. I'd just like to make one observation as well about integration. Because we're talking about post-2015 framework, as a framework that's been coordinated by the UN and will ultimately result in a negotiation between member states of the United Nations. We can see that over the past 20 years, sustainable development frameworks negotiated at the United Nations have fallen into the trap time and time again of resulting in a real, a siloed approach. And it's been really good today to hear some of the representatives from the United Nations speaking about that's been recognised, and this time around, through creating cross-cutting indicators and so on, we wouldn't fall into that trap again.
Thank you. Sorry, right at the end there, I was just checking my notes for the next question forward. But again, if I'm hearing it correctly, it's yes to a goal and to some of the nature of the goals that were laid out, but a strong emphasis on the nature of the policy, programmatic, and accountability framework that wraps around that. And that's built in your mind, again, driven through a rights-based lens.
Yes, because a rights-based approach would force us to look at why is it that the people that don't have access, why don't they have access? And oftentimes we can see it's around discrimination and stigmatization, for example, of marginalized communities. Okay. So taking that rights-based approach can help bridge that also. I don't know if you want to add to that.
I'm going to jump to another question, if that's okay. I'm going to jump, we have just a few minutes. I'd like to jump, if that's all right. Thank you. And if we want to put a few minutes at the end, I'll roll back, okay? But not quite yet. So I did want to pick up on the other thread that was introduced in your opening remarks, and that is, and is part of the questions here, is the relationship of the private sector to these goals. And I wanted to loop back to an observation that Philip made around the notion of a core business link to the Sustainable Development Goals, so that concept of a core business link. And I wanted to look to tie that to a couple of the observations. And Ellen, you talked about the concept of the private sector as facilitators, number one, and number two, as the ability to influence society, as having a leverage role in the trajectory or direction that the society would go. And Henry, you talked about this notion of portfolios of investment in low-income areas, if I got that right. And all three of those seem to be, or would very much relate to the concept that Philip laid out of being embedded in core business strategy. So I'm interested in your sense, and Greg, if I could start with you, that those three areas and possibly others, if those are presented to you, would you say yes, those can fit with core business strategy, and in fact that's the way to think about them?
Well, certainly for us, and I think it should be for all business. I think the way to relate, what you phrased, at least in writing, and I think you're saying right now in terms of water stewardship and water strategies as part of business strategy, that the Sustainable Development Goals should be framed in such a way that they can link directly to what is defined as best performance from a water stewardship standpoint for business. So we have already, as business, leveraged the fact that there were or are Millennium Development Goals as part of the business case, if you will, the justification, the internal motivation for contributing to WASH and some of the other Sustainable Development Goals. So I think the answer to your question is one where you should be requiring of business, government should, and business should act in the absence of government requirements in the same way that we're asking nation states to act, just as we do through the Millennium Development Goals, but we could do so much better in these post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. And so you heard Philip talk about it, and that is, WASH starts with your employee base. You want to have universal access in your place of business. You want to make sure all your wastewater is treated before it's discharged back into the environment at defined levels. You want to make sure the source of water that you are sharing with others is sustainable. So those are business fundamentals, and I think if they are formed or they form the core of the Sustainable Development Goals post-2015, then you have everybody working in concert with government requiring wastewater treatment, businesses treating their wastewater, governments fulfilling the access to water and sanitation, not just protecting the right as the Ruggie framework, I think, falls short in that regard in saying it's the role of government to protect, business to respect, and both to work together on remedy. Well, that's well and good, but who's out there fulfilling it? So business can start with their own operations and extend that into their supply chain while the government works across society to do that. So you could keep going with the parallels, but I think we should be requiring of business what we require and expect of nation states.
Great, Greg, thank you. Henry, I wanted to just do a follow-up question with you after you made your observations. Greg, at the front of his observations, posed a quick question back that said, but what if government isn't there? What are your thoughts on that? What if government isn't there?
That's true. Too often there is a sector strategy and it will be sitting on a shelf in a ministry somewhere and it won't be operationalized. And we're in sometimes something of a vicious circle where many people are not coordinating, many agencies are not aligning behind a national-led plan, and that, in a sense, means that the plan is increasingly ignored and so on. But I just wanted also to take up one other thing Greg was saying, that I think I get a sense, and it may be an exaggeration, but I get a sense that there is an increasing interest in many big private sector corporations wanting to engage in a progressive public policy agenda in the sense that they are now very much engaged. For instance, we see Paul Pullman on the high-level panel, and it would be useful, I think, for NGOs, and I point to my own WaterAid as well as one of them, to engage in some creative partnerships at a national level where we can act in coalition with those companies to push governments to develop a coherent sector strategy. Mm-hmm. I'll leave with one other thought on that, is that the evidence is that the countries that do best, that make the greatest progress in delivering sustainable services, are those that have a robust sector strategy. And to me, I think that's where much of our public policy push should now focus, is looking at that capability of implementation.
Mm-hmm. Henry, thank you. So we just have a minute here before I need to break for the next panel. But and I wanted to come back around. It sounded like a few extra remarks you'd like to make in light of Danielle's comments, if you would.
With regard to this right to water and sanitation, mm-hmm. it is really important in the context of bringing transparency and accountability within the governance. Because currently government system only delivers but is not at all accountable and transparent in actions. So right to water and sanitation brings new framework in terms of delivery. And it also brings a new way of dealing with the governance. Because governance itself is like so many lacunae. So bring the communities at the forefront of the thing. And it also means government should equip itself to deal with the new way of governing the whole programs. So that way it makes a lot of difference. And in terms of governance, I also bring new point. Like in the corporate, today we are meeting. Civil society also has a responsibility because we are all not playing the role due in the governance. Mm-hmm. And corporate should also. There is a called continuum. If you look at the community enterprise building, governance, innovate service delivery, these are alternative things because government has its own way of delivery and we need to find new ways of delivering things and provide options to the community in this continuum. So this to happen, the corporate sector needs to support the national targets, it gets into technology aspects, it gets to innovation services, and act in supply chain, not in their own business, but in terms of supply chain, delivering these programs. And it also look like invest in incubating ideas, because that itself will translate into their own business subsequently. Initially, 5-6 years, there may be social interventions, but subsequently they also have potential to. We have examples. For example, in Morley, where I am working, we have 3 examples. With the FANSA support, we did the governance intervention. Now we are trying to build it as an enterprise model. There, I think 100 million worth of resources for water and sanitation has been mobilized from this program in just 60-70 villages. Just a small intervention in governance using RTI, right information and petitioning as the tools. Similarly, we are working with the WWF and M&S in terms of efficiency in water use in cotton. So this also working is multi-stakeholder engagement, where corporate, civil society, and then the international actor coming together finding solution. On similar lines, we are working with the SWL and then PepsiCo on safe water issues. So what I am trying to say is governance is all about engaging everyone, multi-stakeholder engagement, and everyone has their own responsibility based on strengths, resources and capacities. And that's where, unless you position the rights and water in that context, again it will get privatized totally, and then the poor and other excluded section further excluded. Therefore, right will be central stage, and other actors' strengths will be covering that. That's the framework we need to look at. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. So we need to wrap up, but Dr. Singh, can I trust you to leave us with your 2 takeaway points from this discussion in a minute or less?
Thank you very much. I think the key point basically is water governance, if I may say so, where governments have a role for right kind of legislative and organizational frameworks to be created, but there is a need for institutional changes equally at all levels. Private corporate sector has a very big role equally and very essentially, not only for I would say that providing and meeting those frameworks by sharing the technology, as well as I would say that keeping the overall sustainable goals as part of the core business strategy. I think I'll end up at that. Yeah.
Very good. So if I can, I'd like a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all very, very much.